Hi, welcome to Outlaw Bookseller with me, Stephen E. Andrews, writer, bookseller, collector, general all-round good guy. You know the drill. And a little while ago I posted a video when I was talking about my 90s SF TBR and how I would report back when I've read some of the books. So this will be the first of probably 2 videos, maybe 3, catching up on that. And you know that feeling you get when you've read a lot of books and you've read a lot recently and nothing's really grabbed you, and you've had the temptation to DNF, you know, to sort of put something down because you haven't finished it. And that's never been an issue for me. I've never been one of these people who thought I must soldier on. I've reached that sort of time a long time ago where I could judge quality and the sort of quality which I cleave to and what I think makes a good book. And also, life is short and you can't read everything. You want to agree with everybody. You want to agree with your friends. You want to agree with critics. You want to agree with people you dislike. You know, that's the way it is. Taste is subjective and personal, and it comes out of the way you're sort of formed and your sort of aesthetic development. So I never really have a problem in putting something down forever. Occasionally I will go back to something I think is good. And I have to say, so far, my 90s TBR has been, I must say, a negative experience. I've been reading other things in between, but so far I've read, let me see, 1, 2, I've only read 4 books out of the projected 10 or 12 I was going to do. But it just felt time to sort of talk about them, really. And I'm going to save the best for last, basically, because this is going to be a bit of a rant. And really, I think I've said on the channel elsewhere how I lost interest in SF in the early 90s. And by 1993, I wrote a piece for a fanzine called The Death of SF, which was never published. That issue never came out. And the essay went out, you know, it was junked a long time ago, because I feel like it wasn't well written enough, and I'm a much better writer now. And I became a professional writer as opposed to just a copywriter in the early sort of 2000s. So that was something I didn't want to revisit. But I did lose interest a lot, apart from a handful of people I felt were brilliant, you know, I've always stuck with: Ballard, Priest, Harrison, Gibson, and a few others. And I was still reading the odd bit of vintage SF, as you'd call it these days. But I really felt that after the 80s, which was a fantastic time, there seemed to be a decline in standards of new writers. And there were people who could write perfectly well, but they just weren't interested in me. And I was reading a lot of other things. I've always read other things. I'm kind of feeling I want to cleanse my palate and, you know, read something which isn't SF. I'm actually reading Fellowship of the Rings at the moment by J.R.R. Tolkien, or The Fellowship of the Ring, I should say, which I haven't read for years. And I'm actually quite enjoying it, even though, you know, I do have my serious reservations about Tolkien and the effect that his influence had on the commercial end of fantasy publishing. But enough about that. So I want to talk about what I've read, what I thought, and what I haven't enjoyed. So if you don't like this, well, I'm sorry, but it is what it is. So the first thing I picked up, and as I say, I did use to fill up on Broderick's book, which is over there, Science Fiction 101 Best Novels, 1985 to 2010. From the moment it came out in 2012, and I bought some books then and read them and sort of catch up with those years which I mostly missed. And I got some little hauls, actually, and bought some stuff. And the first thing I started with was The Transmigration of Souls by William Barton, which I had very high hopes for. And it's a book which never really took off for me. It's got an interesting sort of premise to it, which is it's set, you know, about 150 years in the future, and America sealed itself off behind a wall, and there's genetic engineering, all sorts of stuff, and the rest of the world is lagged behind. And there is this alien artifact on the moon which the Americans have discovered, but there is 2 separate expeditions which sort of link up, a Middle Eastern one and a Chinese one, and they're going to find out what's happening there. And the Americans in the book are depicted as sort of hyped up, super sort of genetically engineered titans. Some of them are virtually immortal, but they're also depicted as being kind of immature culturally. And the problem with this, I felt, was that it's full of recursive SF references to other SF, because there's one character who's read a lot of SF and it's referenced all the time. And that to me is the worst kind of eclectic postmodernism. It's really irritating. And while the sort of nerd or geek factor might think that's cool, it doesn't impress me. I mean, if you're going to reference in a subtle way, if you're going to write recursive SF, do it in a blatant way and write an SF novel that's about SF. And you could say that's the case with this, but it's not. And I just found it really tiresome. There were too many characters introduced at once. the prose is kind of like sort of high-end bestseller, and quite honestly, after 150 pages, I'd really had enough. So despite its obvious ambition, I should have been put off by the fact that David Brin liked it, not my sort of thing. And really, you know, I could live without this. The sort of alien artifact leads to time portals to alternate worlds, which is an okay enough idea, but you know, it's bog standard stuff really. We've seen this many times before. And just to sort of have a look at the date, I think this was about 93 to 96, if I can find the printing history, 96. And it's got sort of epigraphs and things mentioning E. Doc Smith and Edgar Rice Burroughs and Stapleton, and then there's a quote from Pilgrim's Progress. But you know, quite frankly, I think people would be better off reading Pilgrim's Progress than reading this. Read some classics and find some real literature. So I'm going to toss that aside. So William Barton, Transmigration of Souls, sounded really interesting, but it didn't work for me at all. What else didn't work for me? Well, this is something which I was in two minds about. This is Bloom by Will McCarthy. And I have to say, again, it's got a David Brin quote on the front. I've never been a massive fan of Brin's work, though I must admit I've not read any for a long time. And, you know, this is very, very much, I mean, it's well written. The guy can write really well, I have to say. And it's pacey. And the basic idea of this, as soon as you look at it, you think blood music. It's about this sort of blight that's appeared on Earth. And it's just sort of wiped people out. And people have had to get off the planet very, very quickly. And they're living in sort of orbital habitats in places like Ganymede and what have you. And there's this strange discovery that there are actually still people on Earth. And there's a lot about nanotechnology. The tech is well described. The dialogue is crackling. What rather worried me was that Will McCarthy, you know, it's Will with a single L if you want to look at it, he also wrote sort of thrillers and techno thrillers with other people, and he has background in science. And there's nothing wrong with the writing at all. The writing's pretty good. But I have to say, I've never been a fan of these sort of retreads of the Blob, because effectively that's what they come down to. And you can dress it up with all the high tech you want, and that's all very interesting and what have you if you're a science nerd. And as Brian Alder said, science fiction is no more written for scientists than ghost stories are for ghosts, and I think that's an important thing. So while this wasn't bad, I really didn't have the urge to finish it. And I do think, again, it was that fast-paced sort of thing. And I will say, even Greg Bear, when I read Blood Music, and I've read it 3 times, it does have that kind of bestsellery feel that you sort of get from 70s books. And, you know, there's this sort of Arthur Haley effect. And, you know, even though it's well written, it's not really literature. But this was much, much better than the William Barton book. But anyway, that's going on the sell pile. Then came something which a friend of mine recommended to me, and it was a New York Times notable book. This is one which wasn't in the, or isn't in, I should say, the Broderick and DeFilippo, and that's The Ragged World by Judith Moffat. There you go. And this is its sequel, Time Like an Ever-Rolling Stream. And the basic idea behind this is that, I know this had lots of acclaim, you know, and the sequel lots of acclaim. And she won the John W. Campbell Award for sort of Best New Writer. That was late 80s, I think. And it's the early 21st century, and you know, the planet's running out of steam in terms of the environmental problem and what have you. And basically, there are these aliens sort of come to Earth, and they're called the Hefen, and they kind of take over and they say, right, you can't do this anymore. You've got to go back to subsistence level. You can't do anything that's damage your environment, and you've got to be good. And you discover that these aliens are quite little. They're rather hobbity, and that was a bit of an issue for me. They are sort of humanoid hobbity types, and there's been a small cache of them who landed on Earth centuries before, and they've been stranded there in the Yorkshire moors. And this looks at what happens out of this through several characters, and the writing is good. She's rather Michael Bishop, but again, it didn't catch fire for me. The premise didn't interest me very much. And you know, you see it through various things, and there's some hardcore stuff in there. There's one part about a guy who catches a variant of AIDS, and it's not pleasant. You know, it does confront some serious things, and obviously it's well-meaning. But the book just really didn't happen for me, and it kind of summed up for me what the problem seemed to be in the 90s with these sort of things. Is that there was a lot of things which were well written and they were crafted, and the overall standard of writing had risen. And this reminds me of something that Colin Wilson once wrote in a book called The Craft of the Novel, where he said about, he taught a creative writing course where, and this would have been in the 70s, the students could all write really well, but they had nothing to write about. And I do think that at this stage, SF seemed to be circling around a number of tropes and the same old things. And, you know, a lot of the stuff which we'd gained ground with in the new wave had been lost and people didn't know where to go. So I do think that since the late 80s, some of the best SF has been stuff which has not been published as SF. And even though I wanted to like these, and there's nothing wrong with the writing, they just didn't grab me, so they're going on the sell pile as well. So far, you know, not a great result. I also read this little novella by Mike Resnick called 7 Views of Olduvai Gorge. And, you know, this was good. I mean, this won the Nebula back at the time. I didn't think it was quite as muscular as it could have been. It's well worth the read. I would say picking it up. Won all sorts of awards, nominated for all sorts of things. And it's about alien archaeologists in the future. They come to Earth and mankind is extinct, but they discover, besides fossils, they discover a new species is emerging. And it's got a quite sort of gothic feel towards the end, and it is part of his big sequence, I believe. And, you know, it's good, it's okay. I think the aliens in it, I just found them a little bit irritating. It was that sort of thing where, you know, almost the writer felt he had to put several species in and he had to sort of try and depict them as alien. But actually depicting aliens as alien is really hard, and I don't know how that quite came off. But that was actually okay. So I'm not going to say too much about that. I do want to get more of Resnick stuff. It's quite hard to get some of it in the UK, and Birthright, which is the one I really want. It's virtually impossible to get over here. So that was okay. Then, this isn't the last, but it's almost the last. But this was the one book which I really liked out of what I've read from the 90s recently. And this was Cave of Stars by George Zabrowski. He started his career in the 70s. This is a late 90s book. And this is about religion. It's quite serious. The first 50 pages I really struggled with. It seemed to be written in a very staccato manner. The sentences didn't flow into each other. It was like they were cut and pasted in. And it all felt a bit sort of stiff. And again, there were a lot of characters introduced quickly, and I really don't like that. I mean, William Golding's book, The Inheritors, introduces about 5 characters in the first page. And I really don't think you get good, deft character drawing that way. It's got to be done gradually, and you've got to mesh them in a way that makes sense. And Mick Herron, the crime and thriller writer, is brilliant at this. And Philip K. Dick is good at it, but a lot of writers are not. But the basic idea of this is a colony planet which has been pretty much out of touch with Earth and settled for about 500 years. And the people there are fundamentally, they're kind of Catholic or Christian, let's just say Christians. I would describe them as Catholic because they have a pope. And they have this fairly stratified society. And they're sort of quite anti-science. And this orbital habitat comes along where people are living, and it's multi-leveled, and there's different cultures inside it, and that's depicted quite well. And the Pope on the planet is concerned because basically the people on this habitat have worked out ways of living forever, of virtually being immortal. And the concern then is that if they live forever, they have no need of God and the afterlife and that sort of thing, and that undermines the faith. And a bit of subterfuge is undertaken, and it has catastrophic consequences for the planet and for the orbital and the people who are the central characters. And I must say my sympathies with this book grew and grew as it went on. There is some good hard SF stuff in it, so it's a bit like a Case of Conscience, sort of mesh with Dow Zero, I guess you would say, and maybe a little bit of Adrian Tchaikovsky's Children of Time, except this of course is from the 90s. And this was at least a serious book and had some things to say, but it was fundamentally saying things about religion and then about the real problems that you'd face if you were trapped in space and relying on drives which couldn't essentially work relativistically very well. But Cave of Stars, that was good, and I'm going to keep it, and I probably will read something else by him. So that was my best of the 90s. I just want to talk briefly about somebody who has become a bit of a sacred cow in SF circles, and I'm not entirely sure that this person is deserving of this. And people are going to hate this. I know 2 of my good friends on YouTube who do SF videos, Matt at Bookpilled and Matt at Science Fiction Reads, are probably not going to agree with me with this, but I went back to this book, A Fire Upon the Deep by Vernor Vinge, or Vernor Vinge. It's Vinge, people say, who knows. And Tom Tone and I talked about this the other day, and Thomason, who didn't get on with it. And I went back to it, and I have to say my real problem with Vinge is that even though I think he has really good ideas, and that's his strength, he was a computer scientist. His first story was published in something like New Worlds in 1964. First novel about 75 was Grimm's World, and then there was a few other things. There were a couple I was involved with at Pan, where I advised them to bid and they won them, and that's Marooned in Real Time, the Peace War. And I'm going to reread those. It's a long time. And I read them at the time. I felt they were okay, but I didn't feel they really came up to it. And I have to say, this sort of merging of the medieval world in this, which is rather like the Strugatsky brothers' Hard to Be a God, which is a much, much better book. The size of this, the fact that it sort of echoed what was happening on the net in the early 90s when it was written with Newsnet groups and the birth of email and what have you. I really felt it was very long-winded, and the whole thing about the singularity and how do you sort of write SF once you come up with a singularity where machines become more intelligent than people. And he had this sort of gradations of space where there's different levels of potential intelligence, you know, and that's very Poul Anderson Bravewave. It's also a bit Stapleton as well. But I really found this a tedious book, because even though he has great ideas, I don't think he's a great writer. And I think SF like this works the best when you've got somebody with good ideas, but who can write like a demon. And there aren't many people who do both, is the fact of it. So just sort of, I want to reference somebody soon who can do both and has done. So I didn't enjoy relooking at this, and I do think it's an overrated book. And it is interesting, and maybe I'll look again at some point. But for me, I really don't think this is the classic people make out it is. But then it's not my sort of hard SF, you know, it's not my thing. So funnily enough, a book by Vinge which nobody seems to talk about very much, or perhaps it's just that I haven't looked, is arguably his most important book, which is The True Names. And True Names was a novella. It was like, not an ace double, it was a double with a George R.R. Martin story. I can't think which one. It was an A format in 79. And this is a Penguin Worlds edition. And Penguin Worlds is a weird little series. And I just think it's stuff that Penguin threw together because they got the rights. The others are We Were About To by Joanna Russ, which is great. The World in Winter by John Christopher, great English catastrophe novel. War for the Oaks by Emma Bull, which is one of the early urban fantasies. E. Nesbitt's horror stories or ghost stories. And this is a really weird little series. And they put them in these nice covers. They got contemporary fiction writers to write introductions. Harry Kunzru did this one, and this is bizarre because it has about 10 essays by different people on how important this book is and its influence and implications, and it gets described as the original cyberpunk book before Gibson, before Shirley, before all those things. And it is about a hacker who, along with a few other hackers, they inhabit this virtual realm and they're doing all sorts of things. The government becomes aware of them. It finds out the true name, the actual identity of one of them, a guy who calls himself Mr. Slippery. His real name's Roger Pollock. And fundamentally, I mean, he gets blackmailed into, you know, doing things for the government and to trying to take the whole net down, because one of them, which may be an AI, which may be an alien, there's all these implications, is causing real harm to the world's economy and things. It's a real issue. And the virtual realm they inhabit is like a fantasy land. It's all castles and elves and that sort of thing, which feels wrong when you look at slightly later things like Neuromancer, when you look at things like Dr. Ada, which is earlier but not published till later. It just feels quite archaic. And again, it does reflect the sort of tying in of computer nerdery with things like early RPG and what have you, and gaming culture and things. And the sort of blackmail part of it is rather similar to the way the case is blackmailed in Neuromancer. But then again, you know, that's been done in lots of things in different ways. So, you know, I think in a video I posted recently about cyberpunk and Frankenstein, I mentioned that in some other context. So this, you know, this is supposed to be the big one. The actual book is a novella. So, you know, you actually look at it and basically you get to page 188 in this edition before you get the novella. And then after that, you know, there's other stuff. So it's very short. You get all this. It's one by Marvin Minsky, important AI sort of pioneer. And people rave about this. But the difference between this and real cyberpunk is, and I've said this before, is it's not punk at all. It doesn't have the attitude. It doesn't have the chromium gleam. It doesn't have the street thing. And, you know, you read this beside Neuromancer and you can see why this is a far more obscure book. People say it's more important. Well, I've got, you know, news for you. In terms of being literature, this isn't that important. As, you know, innovative science in it, yes, quite interesting. But I would point back to the work of Algis Budrys, Michaelmas, and the GI sort of stuff in general information stuff in Delaney's work. And I'd say they're more important, more pioneering than this. This is probably more specific and pointed because he was a computer scientist. But again, I really, really don't think that Vinge is as important as people make out he is. And I think that explains why commercially he wasn't as successful, at least not in the UK, as people like Greg Bear, you know, who had a little bit more nous, a bit more going on. So that's how I was feeling about the 90s so far. So Cave of Stars goes into the sort of permanent library. The others, I'm going to keep this because the essays are quite interesting. So the essays are probably more interesting in the book itself, and that tells you quite a lot, really. So this is now print on demand, so it's really expensive. It's about 16 quid. I mean, when I bought it, it was new and it was £8.99, and this is about 5-6 years ago these came out, and you still get them. And yeah, this is, you know, if you're a sort of computer type guy, you probably love this, but the whole sort of fantasy type world representation in it was a bit too Piers Anthony for me, really. It wasn't that sort of street smart thing that you get in real cyberpunk. So there you are. So out of what I've read so far, the 90s is still a thumbs down. When I talk about the other things I'm going to read, I am going to talk more about the stuff in the 90s I read at the time and other stuff I've read since, some of which wasn't published as SF, which I think is far better. But we'll see. Maybe the things I've got left on that pile will sort of grow in my estimation, and they will sort of pop up. It's probably going to be January, but I just felt, you know, after doing that video, it was time for a catch up, and we did it in the Culture Suite. Look at that, for a change. We haven't shot in here for ages because the video editor is out sort of playing with horses and doing stuff like that, and it's Sunday morning. And I just thought, I may as well, I want to get these off the pile. There's a pile on my table that I used to shoot on of things which need to go into the sell box, and that's it. So perhaps there'll be a video soon about what I'm selling, because I'm going to have a clear out. I just think all these book hauls and stuff, you know, it's a danger. You do end up with a lot of stuff that you've bought on impulse, but you know, it's part of the fun of it as well. Anyway, hope nobody's offended by that. Opinions are healthy. You know, let me know what you think of those books if you've read them, what your views are on the 90s and SF. I guess I'm confirming a lot of people's prejudices. I'm certainly confirming mine, I suppose. But it's not over yet. There will be more 90s to come. So this is Outlaw Bookseller signing out for now. Have a great day. Please like, subscribe, comment, super thanks, all that stuff, and I'll see you again soon. Bye for now.